Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into, well, the ultimate playbook for competitive advantage.
Right.
And we're focusing specifically on how success is achieved, not just by the biggest players, but by the most adaptive.
Or even the luckiest, maybe, the ones who spot the opportunities.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. The whole theme today is summed up perfectly by that Charles Darwin quote. You know the one.
I do. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent.
It is the one that is most adaptable to change.
And adaptability, that's not just a trait, right? It's a strategy.
Hmm.
And our mission for you today is to, extract that actionable playbook.
Yeah.
How do you create something successful
Something with a real competitive edge.
from challenging or maybe just overlooked circumstances?
So to ground this analysis, we're looking at a very specific place, Tigoni in Kenya.
Yeah, if you're not familiar with it, it's just under an hour from the absolute bustling energy of Nairobi.
Right, and Tigoni is completely different. It's known for serene, rolling tea fields, a much cooler climate.
The sources we were looking at describe it beautifully as 50 shades of green.
It sounds so tranquil, but the lessons hidden there are, well, they're intensely competitive.
And that location is so important. I mean, the tea industry itself,
Yeah.
it highlights this massive economic scale.
How so?
Well, the first experimental tea seedlings were planted there in 1903. By 1924, commercial farming was fully underway.
Wow, so over a century.
Exactly. And today, that whole tea value chain it's an economic giant for Kenya. We're talking 2% of the nation's total GDP.
2% is huge.
It is. And it's 40% of its agricultural GDP. It employs 6.5 million people directly and indirectly.
That is the definition of a corporate Goliath in action.
It is.
But we're looking beyond just the massive scale of the tea trade here. We want to understand two fundamentally different strategic frameworks,
Right. We need to explore the something from something approach
which is the strategy of that corporate Goliath we just described.
versus the much trickier and I think far more interesting something from nothing approach.
The underdog's secret weapon.
It's the essential difference, isn't it? Do you leverage overwhelming resources, money, tech, or do you rely purely on creative insight and just better execution?
Which brings us right to the power of perception. I love this quote from Henry David Thoreau. It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see.
That's perfect.
And our first case study really focuses on that power, on seeing potential where everyone else just saw failure. And that's the story of Nifty Café.
So, Nifty Café and Wine Bar opened its doors in October 2021. And its origin story is just a clinic in competitive adaptation.
You'd think a successful cafe in a beautiful area would have a prime spot, right?
It would, but that's the whole point. It was tucked away behind Tigoni's only active petrol station.
That sounds like a terrible location.
It was. Our sources confirmed this space had already been the graveyard for two other businesses. First, a struggling local restaurant, and then a fruit and vegetable shop.
So the location itself was a known liability.
A total liability. It was an unremarkable, bland building. But the owners applied what our sources call nifty smart thinking.
Okay, I like that.
They didn't waste time or money trying to fix the unappealing facade that faced the petrol station.
So what did they do?
They realized the real asset wasn't where customers entered. It was where the building was situated in relation to the landscape.
So they looked in the other direction.
Exactly. They did something really inexpensive but fundamental. They opened up the entire back wall of the building.
Oh, wow.
And built this huge, expansive balcony. It completely changed the experience.
So instead of looking at a filling station,
You're now overlooking the dense, beautiful Brackenhurst forest. They literally took an unutilized asset, that free, beautiful view, and used it to create the entire customer experience.
that's brilliant. It's a perfect example of changing the feeling of a space.
Yes, from a back alley liability into this sought-after forest retreat. And all they did was change the customer sideline.
The owner, Sakina Saif, she has some really specific advice from this whole something from nothing success, right?
Incredibly useful advice.
Mm.
She insists that small businesses, the underdogs, they must insist on great standards
Why that specifically?
because, as she puts it, they don't get the luxury of off-seasons.
That makes so much sense. A corporate giant can afford a bad quarter.
Right. Or a dip in service quality. But a small cafe behind a petrol station, they absolutely cannot.
And those standards require some serious discipline.
Total discipline. Her core lessons really boil down to absolute clarity and just uncompromising execution. Know what you stand for, know the customer experience you want, and then
Be boringly consistent.
boringly consistent in product quality and service delivery.
And what about evolving? That feels crucial too.
Oh, absolutely. She says you have to keep learning, keep listening to feedback, and just keep adjusting. The market changes, people change.
And if you don't evolve with them, you become irrelevant. Fast.
That's the Nifty playbook.
Yeah.
That's the strategy for the resource disadvantaged.
A strategy born of necessity, but also creativity. So now, let's pivot. Let's contrast that with the method of the resource advantage giant, the something from something strategy.
Okay. This strategy is all about utilizing an enormous, rich, well-endowed balance sheet.
So we're talking about massive amounts of cash, liquidity, cutting-edge tech, market share.
Sheer organizational know-how. You're using all of that bulk to simply overwhelm smaller competitors.
The whole approach is designed to basically signal, don't even bother trying to compete with us.
Yeah, and we see this tactic all the time with regional giants like Safaricom or Equity Bank. They have such a significant resource advantage that they can basically dictate the terms of competition.
It makes it almost impossible for newcomers to gain any real traction, at least not using conventional methods.
Exactly. And for these kinds of resource advantaged companies, the strategic advice from thinkers like Roger Martin is crystal clear. If you are significantly better endowed than your competitors, your main goal is to invest in expensive sources of advantage that your competitors just cannot afford to match.
You're looking for what are called scale-sensitive costs.
Yes, let's pause on that term for a second. Scale-sensitive costs. It's the heart of the Goliath strategy, but it's a bit jargony.
So let's unpack it.
We're talking about investments that are, well, staggeringly expensive up front, but they get exponentially cheaper on a per-unit basis the more you sell.
It's like a massive fixed cost barrier that only the giant can afford to climb over.
Precisely. And this is where that anecdote about Nike and Reebok comes in. It's a perfect illustration of this.
Right. This was decades ago when Reebok was seriously challenging Nike in the athletic shoe market.
Yeah. And Nike didn't just compete on, making a better shoe. They competed on cost architecture.
What does that mean?
Well, at the time, marketing costs were usually linear. You spend more, you get more, but the ratio stays the same. Nike inverted that. They invented this new, massive, scale-sensitive cost category.
Athlete endorsement.
Elite athlete endorsement. Think Air Jordan. Think assembling the Olympic Dream Team.
They poured billions into those endorsements. They cranked up those investments to a level that just seemed absurd at the time.
Right. And that upfront investment, the fixed cost of signing Michael Jordan, was so massive that only a company with Nike's scale could even think about absorbing it.
But the cost was huge for Nike, too.
Of course. But here's the magic. For every single shoe they sold, the cost of that endorsement per shoe shrank to almost nothing.
It created an economic chasm.
A huge one. Reebok had neither the sheer sales volume nor the balance sheet to make that initial investment.
So they couldn't compete on that battleground at all.
They were forced to concede it entirely, they flatlined, and Nike just solidified its dominance through sheer expense. So the rule for the giant is clear.
When you have the resources, invest in the most expensive advantages possible.
That's the move.
That makes perfect sense if you have billions in liquidity. But, the vast majority of entities, most companies, NGOs, development partners, they're not sitting on those kinds of resources.
Not at all. They are resource disadvantaged.
Which brings us back to the most important question. How can they possibly compete against that expensive, scale-sensitive approach?
This is the strategic task of the underdog. This is the core of the something-from-nothing move. If you feel strapped for cash and you're facing a resource deficit, the focus has to shift completely.
And this is where Martin's advice gets really counterintuitive. And I think this is the hardest part for an underdog to manage psychologically.
Go on.
He advises the resource disadvantage to consciously refuse to focus on what their competitors are spending their massive resources on.
That takes so much discipline, because your instinct is always to watch the Goliath.
Always. But if you watch the Goliath, you just end up copying them poorly.
Exactly. So instead, you have to ask a completely different insight-driven question, which is,
despite all that massive spending, what are customers still missing?
That is such a powerful reframing.
And we should emphasize this is especially critical because so many modern markets are, as the sources say, two-sided.
Right. You can't just look at the end user. You might have a platform or a B2B service where you have to look at the needs of two or more different groups of users at the same time.
Good point.
So the central task for the underdog is finding inexpensive ways to achieve uniqueness in meeting those specific, unmet customer needs.
And the overconfident giant, the one flush with cash, they often miss those low-cost, high-insight opportunities.
Because they're fixated on high-cost, high-scale solutions. You have to be the one to spot the cool spring in the desert that the competition just drove right past.
Okay, so let's get concrete. What are the pathways to identifying those cheap, unique advantages? Our sources outline two main paths for that something from nothing creation.
Right. Pathway 1 is exactly what Nifty Café did so beautifully, searching for assets that are literally under your nose that aren't being used.
The asset was free. It was the view.
It cost almost nothing to acquire it. It just took the insight to realize its value, and then the structural change to expose it.
So you have to think about the physical knowledge or location assets you already have that you just haven't leveraged yet.
Yeah. And Pathway 2 is about creating cheap but valuable abilities that are tricky for confident competitors to follow.
This means avoiding huge capital investment and focusing on internal capabilities.
These are things you can achieve with mindset and process, not, a massive funding round.
Like what?
Like competing on time, the speed of your response. Goliath often struggle with that because of bureaucracy. Or being highly conscientious, paying extreme attention to detail in your service.
Or maybe being far more tech-savvy in a specific niche.
Yes, in a way your bulkier competition just can't be. Ultimately, the source material argues it's about focusing on genuine, innate attributes like creativity, imagination, innovation.
And actively avoiding that path of stale, worn-out thinking, that creativity.
Yeah.
It's a costless competitive edge.
Which leads directly to a strong warning against a tactic that we see everywhere. Hype. The sources are very clear. Do not compete on height. That space is completely oversaturated and, frankly, meaningless.
I see that happening constantly. When companies start copying each other's excitement or their marketing language,
The more they compete, the more they look exactly the same.
they lose the very uniqueness they so desperately need. Hype isn't a strategy.
No, it's just an expensive costume.
Which brings us to what might be the most powerful and almost no-cost resource for any underdog, the subconscious advantage.
This is a really deep point. The core understanding here is that purchasers are not rational machines.
Not at all.
They buy feelings.
Yeah.
They buy emotions. They buy based on how they want to feel about themselves or their circumstances.
You see this everywhere. And it's not just with luxury goods. Why would someone pay 10 times more for an Apple iPhone versus an Android clone that does basically the same thing?
Right. Or why choose a high-end designer purse or a specific brand of car?
The purchase is driven by that desired emotional identity and experience. It's not driven by a spreadsheet.
And that emotional driver is so powerful, and it's often invisible even to the person buying. Nielsen research found a statistic that is it's astonishing.
It really is.
Roughly 90% of purchasing decisions are made almost subconsciously.
90%, that's huge. It completely changes how you have to think about competitive advantage.
It does. If your only advantage is rational, like, we are 5% cheaper, you're only speaking to 10% of the customer's brain.
Exactly. So the almost no-cost resource we talked about, the ultimate form of adaptation, is mindset.
It's the ability to maintain critical thinking, to see new realities, and, crucially, to manage the ever-increasing pace of change.
And when we talk about change, we mean across all dimensions: technology, climate, politics, consumer taste.
It really is. Everything, everywhere, all at once.
So that adaptable mindset, that ability to continually learn and pivot, that's what allows the underdog to spot and exploit these inexpensive opportunities.
Opportunities that the Goliaths are too slow or too resource-dependent to even notice.
So if the Goliath is focused on the challenge of where can we afford to spend the most,
The underdog has to focus relentlessly on where can we gain the most genuine insight with the least expense.
the true competitive advantage comes from identifying those cheap, overlooked opportunities like a forest view and prioritizing genuine insight over just copying or trying to compete dollar for dollar.
That is the essential lesson of the Tigoni playbook. It's about knowing where to look, but maybe more importantly, training your mind to see what is already there, ready to be leveraged.
Right.
So if you want to apply this lens to your own professional landscape, the final provocative thought we want to leave you with is this.
If you want to see what others miss, stop looking where everyone else is looking. Look behind the petrol station.